Welcome to the event New York City in the 50s and 60s, a conversation with Joseph Ramos, a graduate of Columbia College in 1959. How was our beloved New York City 60 years ago? My name is Graciela Ibanez. I graduated from the journalism school in 2008. With other fellow alumni, we lead the Columbia Alumni Association of Chile. Joseph Ramos, probably our oldest alumnus alive, will take us back in time to see the New York City he lived in as a student. Thank you, Joe, for agreeing to this presentation.
My pleasure. Happy to be alive.
Me too. I also want to thank Columbia Alumni Association in New York City, Global Center, Santiago, and the Business School Alumni Chile for helping promote the event. Thank you everyone for attending. My friend Tomas Dinguez, who also graduated from the journalism school in 2008, will lead the conversation with Joseph. Welcome, Tomas.
Thank you, Graciela, and thank you everybody for joining. Let's and Joe for sharing his experiences, being willing to kind of share his experience. It's not often you run into a native New Yorker, and not often that you have a great time to chat with somebody who's had a important impact here in Chile, and loves Colombia. So I just, as kind of rules of the road here, I think that if sometimes it's actually nice to hear, background audio. Just be sensitive if you keep your mic off or mic on to if any background noises or if somebody else comes into the room, or just put yourself on mute. So I'm wearing a Yankees hat. So as a means of introduction here, I guess about me, I graduated from 2008 from the journalism school, and live here in Chile, running a park. Joe, I have a kind of a connection with Joe through both my father and other family friends, and anytime I get the opportunity, I pick his brain on economics. Now I'm from Washington D.C. I was born in Chile, grew up in Washington. We just got a baseball team, which is the Washington Nationals, and not the New York Yankees, which back in the day was a different team. And as a means of introduction, I kind of want to go through and quote something that Joe put up for his alma mater, which is Regis High School. Now, Regis High School is in the news for a couple reasons. Primarily because of Anthony Fauci, who's the kind of top scientist running or influencing COVID-19 efforts in the United States. He's a graduate, I believe, in 1958. Joe graduated in 1955. I heard about Regis from my friend whose father, Mark Bonamo, whose father was the head physician for the Yankees for a period during the 1980s. And he spoke world of Regis. It's basically a high school, a formative high school, just in the same way that Columbia has formed us. I feel like Regis has formed generations of people, of students and leaders. So as a means of introduction, I just want to read a quote from Joe. Thanks to Regis and the Jesuits, my path to faith began with doubt. Moved on to questioning, I was a class atheist, and developed, and is still developing, into conviction. Regis also inflamed me with ideals. Slowly, I came to believe that the privileged manner of loving one's neighbor in our times was contributing to the economic development of nations. For this reason, I became an economist and went to work in Latin America, first in UN agencies as an advisor to governments, later as a professor, and now as president of Chile's National Productivity Commission. Maybe an important catalyst to the kind of current experience of Joe's influence in Chile and his participation here in Chile was Columbia University. Joe studied when it was a part of the core curriculum as an undergrad, and also studied engineering. So he did more than 4 years, which is a standard undergraduate experience in Colombia. And then after military service, he was part of the Navy. He returned to Colombia as part of as a international fellow at the School for International and Public Affairs. And he liked Colombia so much after that, he decided to continue on and did a PhD in economics, in which his thesis was focused on, correct me if I'm wrong here, generally economic productivity issues in Chile in the 1960s. He described his time at Colombia as a peaceful time, being during a few decades, the 50s and 60s, of immense social change, and describes himself as optimistic, which I think anybody who knows him has a sense of that. He has a remarkable career here in Chile, I think culminating as the Dean of the Facultad de Economía y Negocios de la Universidad de Chile, and is still extremely active. On the 4th and 5th of December, stay tuned. There's a conference titled Productivity and Inclusive Growth, being hosted by none less than the IDB, OECD, Global Forum of Productivity, and the Ministerio de Economía, or Ministry of Economics, Development, and Tourism. So I think, but Joe fundamentally is a guy from Jamaica, Queens. He was born in Puerto Rico.
Born in Philadelphia.
Born in Philly, spent time as a youngster in
Cuba.
in Cuba with his parents, and but correct me if I'm wrong. I think I'm right here. He's a New Yorker.
Absolutely.
So I was just hoping you could kind of start off here and just tell us a little about growing up in Jamaica. Tell us, people, where it is, what it was like then, and a little bit about this recently famous high school called Regis.
Well, fine. Thank you, Thomas. I could go on endlessly, so cut me off at any point. Let me tell you a little bit. Well, there are 5 boroughs. Jamaica's in Queens. It's sort of moving towards Nassau, in more or less the middle of Queens County. Queens, as you all know, I don't know if things have changed, but in my day, it was the most residential borough of New York. Brooklyn in those days, by the way, is the pits. Now that I go to, my wife says, "Oh, we've got to go to Brooklyn." So what do you want to go to Brooklyn for? But I know things have changed a lot. But let me tell you about the biggest changes I noticed. Our neighborhood where we lived was a fairly standard middle-class neighborhood. Row houses, most of them, some of them semi-attached. But what really strikes me is that who lived there? My father was a professional. He was an agronomist. There was a Lutheran minister close by, but most of the others were policemen, firemen, a clerk at a bank. The best house belonged to a taxi driver, or his parents. And my best friend, whom we grew up all the time, was the son of the garbage collector. So it was a community, or New York was an area where you had a lot of income equality by and large. A garbage collector and an agronomist could live in the same neighborhood with roughly similar incomes. I visited this. Well, in those days, everyone was Irish American, German American, Italian American, Polish American, Jewish American, or Latin American in our case. I visited 4 years ago, and of course the homes were the same, but I'd say 2/3 of the population, the people I saw on the streets, were Orientals or Indians from India or Pakistan. So it was complete change. Still a largely immigrant, if you will, population, but altogether different composition.
I think what was remarkable about my friend Bonamo's an Italian last name, and and back then the immigrants, the tensions between Italians, Irish, Polish, you know, you name it. It was a whole different ethnic background back then, and the kind of ethnic enclaves were real. And I, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely the case. In fact, one of the things I've always done, or used to do rather, was when I had some friends coming to New York, I gave them my socio-economic tour, which meant visiting the ethnic neighborhoods. We'd move from Columbia down into Harlem, you know, walk through Harlem, then into Spanish Harlem, then down the east side to Yorkville, which was still an ethnic German community, where, by the way, is where all St. Patrick's parades ended up, so everybody got drunk there, stoned there. Then we'd go down to Chinatown, into the Village, Little Italy, well, the Jewish neighborhoods all over the place. So you're right, especially in Manhattan, there were lots of ethnic neighborhoods. Our neighborhood was a ethnically mixed neighborhood, except for blacks. Certainly, there was de jure, or de facto rather, segregation. There were no blacks in our neighborhood. That was South Jamaica, where the blacks lived.
Hmm. So tell us, you know, I feel like a lot of the experience of, I mean, so what was it like going to school? You know, how far away was that train ride?
Yeah,
you know,
well,
we're talking about 1950.
Well, 1951 to 55.
Right.
That's when I go to high school. And one thing about there are 6 Jesuit high schools in the metropolitan area, and Regis was free and is still free. It's, for those who are from Chile, it's like the Jesuits Instituto Nacional. So it was a fantastic school. It was about 45, 50 minutes away. It's on the east side, around 84th Street, and between Park and Madison in Manhattan. Whereas, so I had to take, you know, several trains, change from locals to express and all the rest. It depending on whether I was in a hurry or not, wait for a bus to go to the subway or walk there. Something I wanted to draw attention to when we were talking about this before is that there was no problem of security when I was going to high school. Just as an anecdote, well, in grade school, my mother just left the back door of our home closed but unlocked because she feared that if she gave me a key, I'd lose it. But there was never, I knew no one who was robbed or mugged or anything of the sort. My first date to a dance at Regis was at age 15, and my date was also 15. We went by bus, subway, and came back at 4 in the morning, and it never crossed our mind that there was any danger. I mean, so this, in fact, as late as 1960, my last year at Columbia, now fast forward, I could walk. I remember going down into Harlem at night alone to Lenox on 125th Street and hearing one of these Back to Africa speakers and argue with him. And only at that point did I say, hey, wait a minute, what am I doing? But 3 years later, you couldn't do that. And I think it's largely because of drugs. You know, we'd go, but in group. For the Apollo Theater, for example, where they had the amateur night on Wednesday, that was in 125th Street. That was also always an interesting event to go to. But anyway, the security was something that changed dramatically, which I attribute largely to drugs. And just as something that people might not know, the subway fare when I was going to Columbia was then 15 cents, and I actually looked it up. That's $1.50 in today. You know, if you adjust for the cost of living, it's $1.50. So it was almost half of what it is actually, in fact, today. And Columbia, by the way, my tuition was, if you adjust, it was $800, which is $8,000 of today's dollars. So not 50,000, which is in fact what they're charging.
Yeah, it's a different time for sure. How did you choose Columbia? I mean, the Queens to the city, 45 minutes away on the train is far away. And, you know, imagine Regis, the expectations were quite high. How did you end up at Columbia? What were the things, what was Columbia at the time?
Well, I actually, my first year, I went to a local college called Manhattan College, because, well, it hadn't even occurred to me to apply to Columbia. It was much too expensive. But by 1956, I was very young. 1956, I was by then 17. And so I could apply for an NROTC scholarship. And there are 2,000.
That would be the
Naval Reserve Officer Training. And, you know, you had to do 3 years of service and sort of thing. And it paid your tuition to any of about 50 of the top universities in the country, Columbia amongst them. And also $50 a month, which was about a third of living expenses at that time. And I won that scholarship. And of course, then I could choose. And I chose to stay in New York. Columbia was the only one in New York, because it would be less expensive for my parents, you know, because I would be living at home. And Columbia was a bit further away, because Regis was on the east side, Columbia was on the west side. Regis is 86, Columbia 116th. So Columbia was about 55 minutes away. And I went 2 years on subway. But, you know, you just do it. You know, sometimes you do some homework while you were in the subway. Certainly did that in high school. But then in my junior year, my father was transferred to Philadelphia, to an office in Philadelphia. And so they moved. So I became an out-of-towner in my own hometown, so to speak. And there's where I moved on campus, first in the dorms in John Jay, then Hartley, eventually in an apartment with some friends. And that's as an undergrad. And of course, in graduate school, I was at iHouse, which was a fantastic experience, as well as apartments.
So you know, I think Columbia, well, just to backtrack a bit, I think that the context of the fact that you did naval ROTC is a big deal. It's basically I think, you know, ROTC was a kind of a military preparation program within high schools that would, I mean, in this case, it helped finance university, where you would kind of, you know, in exchange for being part of a naval reserve, fundamentally.
No, you were in active service for 3 years.
You're in active service. And I think it's important that, you know, because the you know, World War II is not that far away.
Korean War was closer.
The Korean War was closer, and obviously, you know, the Vietnam is percolating in the, you know, U.S. intervention in Southeast Asia is percolating in the background. What you know, did you stand out being a kind of a Navy person or military person in a kind of urban environment? What was that tension? For example, the military is most associated with the South and rarely associated with people from urban environments like New York.
Yeah, well, but we had about 50 every year who had scholarships at Columbia through the NROTC, so it was not a small contingent by any means. This was one of the few actually available scholarships. Incidentally, I had a fantastic military experience. Happily, I didn't have to go to war. There was no war. It was in peacetime. My active service was from 1960 till May of 1963. The important incursion in Vietnam is in 65, towards the end of 65 with Lyndon Johnson. By that time, I was on campus. And in fact, when the real campus upheavals start going, which is May of 68, I was already in Chile as a visiting prof. So I sort of missed, happily, the war. The Navy experience was fantastic, I might say. I learned a lot about engineering. I worked in Spain on 2 different occasions. I was in the Antarctic for 4 months. visited New Zealand, we're stationed in Rhode Island, traveled a lot and learned a hell of a lot. But anyway, that was a naval experience. And in those days, at Columbia, there wasn't any animosity because there was no war. As the Vietnam War takes hold, that's when the student movement goes against. I don't know if they still have the NROTC at Columbia. They may have abolished it, as they did in many universities.
Well, in my experience, I used to cover the military for the Star Ledger in New Jersey, and there's a very active, did a couple stories about veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. And, Columbia actually has an extremely active veterans program to incentivize people returning from war to integrate back into campus, be it at generally at a kind of a grad school level. Now, when you return from your military service, that's when you went into SIPA as an international fellow. What had changed in New York? I'm sure you had changed a lot, but what had changed in NYC, in New York, in the city at when you returned? You were a different person. Yeah.
I think the most important change was what I just mentioned about security. I think that, and which I attribute, to drugs, criminality arising from drugs, and all the rest. Did
you feel it? Were there times? I mean, you were on campus at the time. What was the environment on campus like? No,
you didn't say. No, it wasn't on campus. It was just all of a sudden there were. That's when they started putting policemen on subways, that sort of thing. I mean, that was unheard of when I was in high school, and or even in grade school. So it was a fairly rapid change. I would say that's the most important thing that I noticed. And of course, politics became much more important on campus, especially I'd say post 65, maybe 66 onward. As an undergrad, these were the Eisenhower years, which was a much less politically polarized environment than you have with Vietnam, then Watergate, and all the rest.
So what was life around campus? What was your experience like while at SIPA and during that international fellowship?
Well, the International Fellows Program was a fantastic program. You could study whatever you want, and I went into economics, but you could study, theology, political science, anything, as long as you were committed, or at least an expectation, to make an international career with whatever you were studying. And we had a core course given at SIPA. The professor was called John Stessinger, but basically he brought speakers from the outside. I mean, we had fantastic speakers. I had Kissinger, we had Brzezinski, we had Karl Deutsch, Herman Kahn, thinking the unthinkable, on a slew of issues. It was really fascinating. That was for 2 years, 64 and 65. And also they organized, especially at the beginning, a visit of ours to Washington, to visit, the Congress and all the rest. And probably what stands out most in my mind, that around, must have been September of 63, I was just back from the Navy, all 50 of us or 40 of us, I forget how many of us were in the International Fellows Program at the time, went to visit Robert Kennedy. I mean, where he was Attorney General at that point. I remember we all went to his office, and we couldn't all sit. We stood around, but he must have given us 2 hours of his time, giving us his vision of answering all sorts of questions. His vision, both of foreign policy. In those days, I don't no longer remember the content of the conversation, but Bobby Kennedy was something of a hawk international. In fact, John Kennedy was. I mean, you may not know this, but his big campaign against Nixon and Eisenhower was the missile gap vis-a-vis the Russians, because they'd launched Sputnik and sort of felt that the U.S. was falling behind. And then, of course, there was the conversation on domestic policy, where civil rights was becoming important. In fact, just a month before, had been the March in Washington, in which happily I was able to participate in. I just got back from Europe.
I think it's important to note that, you know, RFK is assassinated in 1968, just a couple years afterwards, and his brother was assassinated, you know, in November of 1963, which is just a few earlier. So, you know, the context of you know, these events is important. Where were you when you heard the news of JFK?
It was about 2:30 in the afternoon. I was sitting in a barber's chair in Colombia. I still had hair, and I forget who it was. Flash, Dallas. It is reported that the president has been shot. We're all in a state of shock, and within 2 minutes, flash, the president has died. And I remembered getting out of the barbershop and just walking to the closest church, and just sitting there, just appalled and knowing not what to do. I mean, the city was a morgue at that point. People were huddling together. Nobody studied for any number of days. It was quite a shock, because it wasn't that he was perceived as the greatest leader of the world. I think his image has improved with time, but the idea of an assassination was just, since Lincoln, well, I don't know, McKinley too, but it was just nothing of our era.
Do you remember any, interactions with fellow New Yorkers on the streets? I mean, in that time?
It just so happened, I think this was a Thursday, and my first 2 years back at graduate school, my scholarship, the International Falls, covered tuition and part of my living expenses, but not all of them. And so I stayed in the Navy Reserve, because I would get, if I went for a weekend to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, to a construction battalion reserve unit, I'd be paid as if I were an officer. We weren't paid a big deal. It was $250 a month for a month's time, not 3 days. But anyway, so it just so happened that was the weekend. And so I went to my reserve duty. And of course, we didn't do anything. I mean, we didn't do any preparation. Everybody was just shocked. They were all engineers in the reserves who had been in the Civil Engineering Corps of the Navy, and now were doing reserve duty. And of course, they were all in New York, working in New York. And so we just spent the 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, just talking about it. And then, of course, seeing Ruby kill Oswald, we saw that on television. I mean, it was just another shocker. And so slowly, we were able to do sort of a catharsis. And I'd say that's what those 3 days were like.
Wow. What was the environment at that time? I guess it was shortly before heading into to SIPA, right? So
I was just starting in SIPA.
Right.
It was my first semester back in graduate school.
Mm. And so back at Columbia, life on campus, you start developing, I guess, I don't know when we pulled up your socioeconomic tour of New York, but New York was a completely different place at the time. I think you were mentioning the number of newspapers, as a Yankees fan, you were reading a couple of newspapers a day. There was 5
when the Yankees won, which was most of the time.
New York was a completely different place at the time. And what was kind of visiting, these enclaves like, downtown, what streets would you go to, specifically that you liked, that you had fun in? Yorkville
was something that I did, especially when it was high school, because we were very close. Once I was at Columbia, the village became the more frequent haunt. By the way, it was a very austere life. when I say go to the village, it was mostly to walk around, not to eat or something like that. And and you would have a beer or a glass of wine, and that would be it. If you took out a date, in those days, boys paid or men paid, not the girls. But it was understood that she would ask for nothing more than one glass of beer for the entire evening. No more expenses than that.
And you said you walked down the street, stepping over drunks.
That was the Bowery. Yeah, well, that was another thing. I was involved both as an undergrad as well as a graduate student. I used to visit the Catholic worker movement, which Dorothy Day, a very prominent social activist, she had soup kitchens in the Bowery, and I'd go visit her, try to participate a little bit. And the thing that I remember about the Bowery, especially, was that it was the one place in New York where there were people sleeping on the street. Now you have people all over the place, but that was the only place. They weren't sleeping; they were drunk on the street, and of course we became sort of inured to this. That is to say, I'd be with somebody, showing somebody around from Puerto Rico or outside of New York, and say, well, how come you just passed this guy by? And I say, oh, well, he's just a drunk. It didn't occur to us to be good Samaritans to the people in the Bowery. But that was the only place that was that way. And of course, I visit there often when visiting the Catholic worker, because that's where they had their headquarters and soup kitchens. But there were all kinds of things that did. One of the free things, we'd go to night court. Night court was an event where you went to, it was open to everybody. You could just, and you'd see all kinds of cases. Generally they were, if somebody was drunk, some petty theft, a bit of violence, but it was interesting to see the sort of the human condition, and it was free. You could just go down there. A little bit of social action too. We had a group that was involved in some sort of social action, and I remember, it crossed our minds to visit some of the prisoners in one of the local county jails. These weren't, murderers or that sort of thing. These were just local crimes. So there were a lot of activities of that sort.
I remember you mentioning that we were talking about subways, and there wasn't that population of guys who would ride the subways all night long, or be kind of mumbling in a corner, and it strikes me, and you mentioned how there was a period, obviously there's a period where not, you mentioned the seats that had kind of a straw filling on them, and they were clean and there was no graffiti. And then all of a sudden, there was guys, kind of homeless guys, probably mentally unstable folks, riding the trains. And I realized, I think, the 50s and 60s, your period in New York, you witnessed an enormous amount of fundamental changes in the identity of the city.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Well, I told you of our neighborhood. New York was then, and still is, and I understand the statistic is 35% of New York City, the metropolitan area, were born abroad. So they're immigrants. It's still an immigrant city, and I think that that's a fascinating aspect of it. Many of the ethnic neighborhoods that I was talking about are those who didn't assimilate, and so in that respect, it's not so good. Maybe it's fun to visit, but they're not so good. My neighborhood underwent a complete transformation, as I told you. We from Irish Americans, Polish Americans, German Americans, Hispanic Americans. You had now Indian, Pakistani, and Oriental Americans. Complete change.
So,
Yeah, I think what happened, again, sociologists will explain this. It was especially later when when I was already in Chile and I'd visit New York. I said in the early 80s, it was terrible. It was the graffiti and all the rest. Let me just give you an anecdote. I had a classmate who was a teacher in the public schools of New York. And she said, in fact, this is the early 70s. And she showed me the manual they gave new teachers. And one of the chapters was how to defend yourself in case of an attack with a knife. Incidentally, the first thing to do was, if you're close to the door, run. Get out. And she said, the previous edition, I don't know, 5 years before or 10 years before, was what do you do with kids who are chewing bubble gum while they're standing in line? So it was a radical shift in a question of 10 years. And I attribute this, as I said before, I think to drugs. The other thing, especially with people on the streets, the homeless, I understand that this in large part had to do with the release from institutions for the mentally disabled or weak or handicapped. They had a lot of people who could sort of cope, not well, but could cope, and who were sort of closeted in these mental institutions. Well, the courts decided that that was wrong, that these people had a right to live as they wish. Probably most have made out decently, but many of the people that you find homeless and all the rest are people who were released from these institutions. Plus, of course, all those who then got into drugs and all the rest. And so there was a time in New York when I think this was really depressing. I mean, going to the subway, now visiting in the 80s, I felt that this was a no man's land, that the law didn't, there was no law here. Sort of like those who are from Chile, it's sort of what happened with Plaza Italia during the social upheavals. Every day, you just had to skip Plaza Italia because it was controlled by somebody else.
Mm. So I propose, I think I've got a couple of photos, Joe shared, and, share run through them a little bit. I find them kind of fascinating. And then maybe, we can just open it up to questions, Graciela. And I think people have some probably much more interesting things to ask Joe than I do. So I would hope that that folks, share their experiences at Columbia and have a few questions for Joe. Let me just key this up here. And Graciela, help me with time. So we can do this. Give me a second.
While you're doing this, Tomas, let me just say that you skipped, because you can't talk about everything, but I think it would be unfair. The most important intellectual experience that I had in my life was the core curriculum of Columbia College, which I think is just fascinating. And if I went from engineering to economics in a large sense, it was because that was mind-boggling. And I think that was a reason to go to Columbia then. It is a reason to go to Columbia now. It was a sort of education that I think you don't find in many places. And you certainly don't find it, much as I love Chile, much as I love our university, you don't find it here. Here people go into their studies in a very narrow field right from the start, whereas in Columbia, everybody had to do the core curriculum. And, I don't know if you've heard, Columbia, it was known in two ways. It's the poor man's Princeton, and the other one is a Protestant college where atheists teach Catholicism to Jews. It's a Protestant college because it was founded as Anglican, under George the somebody or other before independence. The atheists, of course, are the professors. The Catholicism is sort of Western civilization from Middle Ages onward, and Jews, half of Columbia College was Jewish because it drew heavily on the New York City population, and and the Jewish percentage in New York City is heavy.
Yeah,
But anyway.
I think it's important to you know, I agree with you. I think the undergraduate experience at Columbia is I think what defines it as a university of prestige, and makes it officially part of the Ivy League. Just for a fun fact, you know, the Ivy League is a sports division. The only reason why it's called the Ivy League is because they all play sports together.
And they're all pretty poor.
Well, they used to be.
In sports.
Oh, right, exactly. Well, it's probably a good thing. And I think that what's also interesting is the tremendous kind of religious diversity that you find in you know, in college campuses. I think it's fascinating, and it's I think definitely something about the U.S. is this exposure to so many different people out there. So let me just run through. Let's start at the top here. Give me a second.
This one here?
Nope. Give me a sec. There we go.
Oh, well, all right. That's my father and mother, and well, that's myself. The day I was graduating, I graduated from high school. This is a sort of in front of our backyard. Our backyard is pretty teeny, but that's it. And I think that's the last day, and that's the closest I ever was to a tuxedo. Never again.
Well done.
This is my first dorm. This is in John Jay. This is with one of my two roommates. We had a triple. They were monastic cells. Incidentally, we had a triple, but Kim Novak, if you learn, is in the background there above a towel, but she's not part of the triple. But anyway, these were very tiny rooms. It's not like the dorms now. I mean, dorms now are like going to a hotel. You know, there's small apartments. Then it was really tight. This is graduate school. This is 1966. I was at SEEP at this point. It was an International Falls program. What
beach were you at?
We were at Jones Beach. The two chaps that I'm with are roommates. We had an apartment together where we paid $160 a month on 111th Street between Broadway and Amsterdam. And when the owner wanted to hike it to 180, we refused. And we looked around, but we were finally forced to pay it 180. But you know, it's 10 times that in real terms today. And the one in the white bathing suit is a girl. It was actually my girlfriend at the time, and the one black was a good friend.
Excellent. So Jones Beach is where is that? That's
Jones. Yes. Well, that's right. I forget that we're not talking to New Yorkers necessarily. This is out in Long Island. Jones Beach is in Nassau. Now, if you keep going from Queens, you go to Nassau and eventually to Suffolk County, and then you're at Montauk Point. But Jones Beach is a beautiful beach. The Rockaways are in Queens. You know, actually, it's a good beach too. But you know, Jones Beach was less densely crowded than all the rest.
Also a good surfing beach. Also, I mean, for folks who have a kind of idea of the United States, or you know, who's imagine su imaginaria de los Estados Unidos is a product of both you know, fiction and you know, real life. You know, in fact, there were paper routes. There were many papers, and I just found out that Joe delivered newspapers. I'm not sure. Were you on foot or on a bicycle back then?
On a bicycle. I went to bicycle in grade school, and I had a route for about 3 years.
I love it.
I was the local capitalist. So I would sometimes my friend would say, "Hey, come on, let's play football." I said, "Well, you know, gee, I have to finish the route." And they said, "Well, I will help you." "All right, so I'll give you a quarter." Incidentally, I'd make about $1 per day, so a quarter. I wasn't really being too exploitative. But anyway.
Right. And what would $1 a day get you?
Well, I looked it up for this talk. The cost of living has gone up 10 times. So we're talking about 10. It's the equivalent of what you could buy with $10 today. So it was not to have a newspaper route was pretty good.
Right. So here you are. This is not, you're not in the photo. These are your friends in at the
I
I
House.
House. I
Yeah.
don't recall that view. It's gorgeous, although I'd spent very little time in the area of the I House. Where was this?
It's if let me see, Riverside Drive is further behind you. The river is sort of behind you and a little bit to the right. And this is adjacent. This time, if you walk out of I House of one of the side doors, it has these gardens with these tables, which this obviously with the spring or the summer, where we were still sitting outdoors.
Sure.
This is these are graduate students, all of them in economics, except for the two women are spouses, and this is Johnson Hall, outside of Johnson Hall. Johnson Hall's the graduate dorm for women, and we used to lunch at Johnson Hall as a practice, and that's us.
So one of the I was struck by this photo. Both. I was struck partially by the sartorial sense of your classmates. And there's a question by Ken Kosi, and he's asking kind of, was the Mad Men series a good representation of the peoples and attitudes in New York City in the 60s? I see Mad Men here. I could be totally off, but did you see Mad Men? Did you think it was accurate representation of that time period?
I never saw the series, so I can't really tell you. Remember, I was here from '68 onwards. I'm in Chile.
Right.
So this is what
people
I was
were
surprised when I saw this photo.
Yeah.
When I was looking up this photo, is that I don't remember us normally being so dressed up. Well, I wasn't all that dressed up, but the one in the middle, he's from India, Krishan Saini, remember his name. He eventually was a prof at University of Texas. And he always wore a tie and jacket. The one sitting is the son of the Belgian ambassador to the UN, who unfortunately died very young. And he always was wearing a jacket and a tie. The other two, I don't remember their names any longer, but I don't remember that this was common. People were.
Right.
I thought that it was unusual to wear a tie and a jacket to class.
Huh. So you guys get
this is some once a semester or maybe twice. While we were at I House, fantastic experience, incidentally. We'd go to a restaurant, a real restaurant, not the dumps that we ate every day, but a splurge. And so we went on a splurge, and you see the girls dressed up real nicely. And here I did put on a jacket, a tie, and I see a tie clip.
You're looking really sharp, I've got to say. This is.
I thought the photo at the beach was fantastic.
Well, my only comment there was that I think that you reminded me of a taller Joe Biden, but I could be wrong.
Oh, gee.
Not by the politics. I don't want to push you in any corners here.
No corner there. I already voted for him. Incidentally, my ballot my residence is the last one I had at Columbia, which is on 119th Street.
Wow.
I actually only voted physically once there, which was the election of '64. Johnson against Goldwater. I won't tell you who I voted for. And
so before we kind of move to your last photo here, this is a question from Catherine Mulder. Were there, where were the women? Where were there women studying? Were there women professors? What was were there people living together?
Well, let me answer that. I'd say in graduate school, of our classmates in economics, maybe a quarter were women. Okay, these two are graduate students because they were at iHouse. iHouse is exclusively for grad students. But I would like to also point out that when I was in Columbia College, in our Navy group of 50, there was one black. And I'd say at Columbia College, generally speaking, that percentage, 1 in 50, 2%, is probably true of the college as a whole. I doubt that there were, if the college had 2,000 students, I doubt that we had more than 20 blacks or 30 blacks. Just, it was infinitesimally small. And I might say I don't think there were more Latinos. I wasn't conscious of this. I was one of the few Latinos, but
right.
This is pre-affirmative action, pre-minorities, and all the rest of the stuff.
When did Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Because she was making headway as a professional around this period of time, right? Not necessarily at Columbia, but as a woman entering the profession.
Yeah, well, I don't remember having any. Certainly at graduate school, and in fact, as an undergraduate at Columbia, I don't remember having had any woman professor.
Wow.
Not one. Neither in the college. There must have been, but I just didn't happen to have one. Women were scarce. Maybe in general studies there were women, or of course, if you went to the French department, you remember I was at Columbia College, but generally in the sciences outside of the core curriculum. So these were overwhelmingly men.
Right. So this is your photo in 2006.
This is our home. Well, we visited with my wife. We were out Long Island one day about 4 years ago, and we were going back to Manhattan. I said, "Hey, we're close to my house." So I took it to the old neighborhood. We saw this is our house. We of course we didn't have air conditioning in those days, nor all these drains. I don't know where they came from, these white drains. But this is it. This is an attached home on both sides. That's where we lived, and I said that's where somebody who could be the son of that's where the garbage collector could live, or a fireman could live, or an agronomist could live. Our next door neighbor there to the left was a Lutheran minister. It was a very equal time in terms of income distribution. I mean, I don't think that there are many cases that you can say that a garbage collector, a fireman, somebody who operates a lathe, a bank clerk, a taxi driver, they can all live in the same houses.
Well, I seem to remember, when I was at Columbia, my beat was Red Hook, and I spent a lot of time. This is 2008, kind of right on the cusp of kind of serious gentrification. Williamsburg was a thing, but it wasn't, I would say, kind of commodified as it is now. But what Red Hook was the kind of hulk of an industrial past. And shipping was a thing. There was guys who would work on boats and welding boats together and doing maintenance. I mean,
New York City was the largest port in the United States in terms of handling cargo. I'm not talking Jersey. New York City.
Wow.
When I was in the Navy in 1957 or 58, one of our cruises, because every summer we had to do some sort of training. I was on an aircraft carrier, and its second stop was New York City.
Wow.
I had an aircraft carrier, dock in Manhattan, on 40th Street or wherever it was. And now that's all gone. And of course, that accounts for the fact that all that West Side was the dumps. These were sort of slum areas. The Irish immigrants would live in that sort of area. But of course, this has all been gentrified once the cargo has gone. In those days, the only way to get to Staten Island was in the ferry. There were no bridges. It was just by ferry. I had a roommate from Staten Island, and he just went by ferry. Incidentally, that used to be 5 cents then. Now it's free. So that's the one thing that's really changed for the better.
Did you another question from Ken is did you ever pass through the Navy Yard? What was the Brooklyn Navy Yard at that time? Is that where you went for ROTC duty?
No, not for ROTC. That's when I was in the reserve.
Got it.
In the reserve, you went there to do training duty. To be honest, the training, we were underpaid and absolutely underworked. I mean, they paid us little, but we did nothing. I mean, we didn't train. Basically, the officers sat around and talked about their businesses in New York, and we had to see some film or something or other. But it was a joke. The Navy Yard wasn't a joke, but what we did in the reserves was a joke.
Right. And just sort of kind of background, you know, the military reserves in the United States is kind of it's kind of like the National Guard to some degree, but where, you know, there's regular training, maybe with monthly exercises.
That's right.
There's certain degree of benefits, healthcare, and you know, it's basically in the case that the military is exhausted, there will be a military reserve for whatever the nation needs. And you see this as part of it's a really important part of the military community and military fabric throughout the United States.
Yeah, no, that's you've described it rather well. I might say that I went into the reserves. I dropped out of the reserves in my third year when I got a fellowship to come to Chile, a traveling fellowship, and I sort of, and you were allowed to drop out. Incidentally, so this is 1965 when I drop out. So I dropped out just before the upsurge in Vietnam. I wasn't even thinking about it. It wasn't really in the news. And so, you were allowed to do that.
Well,
you were allowed to do that.
I'm glad that you did not go to Vietnam. You did your service. Too. And
I mean, otherwise, the Vietnamese might have won earlier had I gone.
So a couple of questions about the core curriculum, one from Camilo Ascarate and the other one from Graciela. It says, I love the comment about the importance of core curriculum. 17 years ago, I was a preceptor. I'm not sure what that means.
I think it's Princeton, like a TA.
Got it. At Princeton, at the time I started as an ombudsman there. I was asked to precept for the class on Latin American history. They were very serious about the core curriculum. And also, I think, you know, Graciela says, what did you like the most about the core curriculum at Columbia?
Well, the core curriculum, for those who don't know it, no matter what you were studying, whether you were pre-med, pre-engineering, you wanted to be a physicist, you wanted to be a French major, literature, whatever, everyone had to take the 4-semester course called Contemporary Civilization, which was basically the readings from the Middle Ages right up to the present, or the present of that time, where you read Thomas Aquinas, Kant, Hume, Freud, Marx, Nietzsche, Weber. I mean, it was just fabulous. Of course, you didn't read the entire works or anything of the sort, and with discussion. 2-year course. With excellent professors. My best professor in this case was a famous philosopher called Sidney Morgenbesser, second year. But anyway, it was just a fabulous course. It was mind-boggling. Everyone had to take the 2-semester course on Western literature. I say the canon of Western literature. Again, fabulous course. Everyone had to take the semester course in music, which I loved. Everyone, it was the first time I'd ever heard Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So I proceeded to buy a phonograph after the first class, and I went out to buy the record, but I confused Beethoven's Fifth with Tchaikovsky's Fifth, and I actually bought Tchaikovsky's Fifth, which turns out to be a piece that I actually love a lot too. But anyway, everyone had to take course in fine arts, the course in fine arts. And these are not by teachers. These are we had a sculptress who was teaching us this. Music was taught by a composer of opera, Jack Beeson. I remember his name. Fine arts is the course I learned the most, and I got my lowest grade. I basically went from an F- to a C+. You know, I really improved a lot, but it was just fabulous. Everyone had to take a year of science. Everyone had to take a year of math. Well, and since I was a pre-engineer, obviously I had that covered. But I thought that was, it was just fundamental. I mean, it was what Columbia called the whole man.
Well, I think
I understand that nowadays they offer you not only Western civilization but East Oriental civilization, and that sort of thing.
I think it's important, at least for in other contexts. I think we speak from we know Chile the best, but undergraduate education in the United States is formative and probably defined by opening up your intellectual experience as opposed to restricting. So it's a process of opening up inquiry rather than focusing yourself towards one particular career or another.
But you're right, Thomas. But there's one other thing. The core curriculum is not just a smorgasbord that pick and choose whatever you want. Everyone had to take this. In other words, there was an option. You didn't have the option of, I want to take a course in political science. I want to take one in economics and one in this. I mean, there were electives, but everyone had to take this, whether you liked it or not. It was beyond dispute.
Well, I think that speaks a little bit to, if we're speaking about Princeton, Columbia, these are really old universities, and, university education was the domain of the privileged. And it harked back to, I feel like a kind of a much more traditional sense of what an education is, and also a sense of responsibility that the people passing through are not kind of going to be theoretically leaders of society. They actually will be, right? They take one step outside of university and they go directly into some sort of leadership position. So a couple questions.
Thomas, can I just interject one thing?
Sure.
I said also it was a poor man's Princeton. The other day, I think you raised the question at Tufts. I think you studied, there were a lot of kids from, private schools, Groton and all the rest. I don't remember anybody, there must have been some, but I don't remember anybody at Columbia College who'd gone to a private school. I met my first private school students, because I'm not considering Regis a private school, it was free, but it was when I was in graduate school. That's when I met people who had actually gone to these, Andover, Groton, these places. And Columbia, in that respect, was much closer, I think, in its social composition to what America is. Without, obviously it was still people who were middle class and beyond, probably.
Right. So one question from Juan Somavia is, when, going back to the point about drugs and violence in NYC, I guess when did you get a sense that drugs became kind of equivalent to violence?
It was by 1963. It was in a very brief span of time. I left Columbia College in a School of Engineering, really, in 1960. And as I said, in 1960, I could walk into Harlem alone at night. In 1963, I just wouldn't dare. We would go as a group, so it wasn't all that insecure. We'd go as a group, as I said, to the Apollo Theater and that sort of thing. But I might go with some others together in the Saturday afternoon. But after 1963, but I think in just that short span of time, I noticed that change obviously became much worse. I don't know, probably by the late 70s or something of the sort. But the big change was very rapid.
I feel like, if anybody's an expert in substance abuse and the history of the United States, chime in here. But I feel like heroin was quite big back then, and then in the 80s, crack and cocaine were the biggest ones, kind of to hit urban environments. And not to just in respect of time, Graciela, and if you, however you'd like to manage, but just kind of wrapping up here, a question from Javiera did iHouse celebrate parties like all nations?
Oh, absolutely.
Participate in a very fancy dinner. You spoke of a couple events there. Yeah, go
Oh,
ahead.
yeah, no, I-House was, I mean, you had to discipline yourself to study while at I-House. I don't recommend it while you're going for your PhD. When you're writing a thesis, yes, but when you're studying, I don't recommend, because there's so much temptation. There was always something going on. There were public speakers who were brought, discussion groups and that sort of thing. Oftentimes we were invited out of the city for a weekend on some issue or other. Once a month, at least, there was a mass celebration, dinner together, celebrating, Indonesian night or, or Mexican night or whatever. It was simply, so there was always activities. And of course, every day in the halls, in the living room, there was something going on. There might be dances, there might be music. So it was a place where, and that's where we'd end up after studying. At 10 o'clock, we'd go and have a beer and go into the public rooms. I saw a question by Juan Somavia there. Did I meet any Chileans? I met 2 Chileans. One who is still a very good friend, Jorge Mardones. He had come from MIT, and he came to Colombia for 1 year. I met him just before I came to Chile, and we're still very good friends. And the other one I met was the son of Lola Botka and Utov, the founders of the Chilean National Ballet, whose name is Miguel Utov. And I wasn't very close with him, but there were a lot of students from Juilliard, and I met Miguel there. And how life is, I became a colleague of his brother, Andras, who is an economist from Berkeley, and he's become very famous of late, especially of late, on pension issues. So I actually did meet those 2 Chileans, but there were very few Chileans, at least that I was aware of at the time.
So, well, I think in respect of time, I think if anybody has a last question, we can present this to Joe. I think I thank you, Joe. It's important to also note that Joe is the inaugural outstanding alumnus of the Columbia Alumni Association of Chile, and due to his contributions here in Chile, and obviously his passion for Colombia, and as someone who's bicultural, being both from the U.S. and Chile, I appreciate the different perspectives that you bring, but also the fundamental connections you have to each nation. But we've also been using, it's very helpful, his perspective in helping us guide the alumni organization. So thank you all for participating. Please send us, feedback. I'm tempted with a relatively small group to just kind of open things up and chat. But maybe we can set up another great conversation for another time. And just to, before I kind of I want to hand off. So thank you very much. And I want to hand off to Graciela Ibanez, who's the head of the directoria really of the Columbia Alumni Association of Chile. Así que Graciela, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone. This was fascinating. Thank you, Joe, for taking us back in time. And we look forward to seeing you in our next event. There, I put on the chat where you can follow us and learn about the Columbia Alumni Association of Chile.
Well, it was a lot of fun. Bye to everyone.